Pokemon is in an interesting position. With Regulation G for VGC just starting out at the time of this recording, I thought there would be no better opportunity than to talk about power creep in Pokemon. What is up YouTube, it's your favorite cloud chaser Oaken64, coming at you with a new discussion video. Today we are talking about power creep in Pokemon, its effects, how it has been approached, and how I think that the Pokemon Company could better handle power creep if given the chance. Firstly, what is power creep? My favorite definition of power creep is the concept that elements introduced to a game over time grow in power as compared to the original elements in the game. It's just a natural trend of multiplayer games. As the design space gets pushed, more and more powerful elements tend to be introduced, from things that were previously thought to be rules are shattered by new concepts breaking those rules. There is a bunch of things False Swipe Gaming had already said about power creep in Pokemon, the additions of new types, abilities, moves, and the physical special split among them. While they are true, I also think that it's not as black and white as that. In addition to increasing the power curve, I also think these additions tie into the evolution of how the game operates. Another example being adding the new summoning mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! They aren't going to be inherently stronger than another mechanic unless the designers want them to be. The addition of these mechanics made certain Pokemon stronger or weaker over time. Pokemon designed in Pokemon Red and Blue aren't designed in the same way as the ones in Scarlet and Violet, whether it be design-wise, but more importantly for this video, stats-wise. Stats in Pokemon is a part of its identity. It's probably one of the more invisible parts of a Pokemon. It gives a Pokemon a role to play in a team. For example, Weavile is fast but frail, Shuckle is slow but bulky, and that's fine in an RPG. Some Pokemon are just going to be better than others at different things. The problem that's starting to take form is just the sheer number of Pokemon that are available. Sure, you can have a fast and frail Pokemon, but how do you make it different or more enticing to use than another fast and frail Pokemon? There's two methods that are normally used. Option A is to make it work differently from the other Pokemon of its role. Core A Gaming had released a video of the mentality game designers should have when balancing. That is to give weaker characters more options than to just go and nerf the strongest things. In Pokemon's case, there are a lot of Pokemon that have the same plan, but go about it in different ways. To put it in further detail, nerfing and buffing shouldn't be done without a purpose. True balance is boring, and certain Pokemon having or lacking strong moves can make it interesting. My favorite example is Iron Bundle. While it is blindingly fast and strong, its best stab options are Freeze Dry and Hydro Pump, a move with lackluster power outside of stab, and a move that has issues with its accuracy, so much so that it's become a joke in of itself. Another example is Garchomp and Flygon. Garchomp and Flygon have the same typing, but only Flygon has Dragon Dance. The power level hasn't increased in this metric because when it comes to team building, you tend to not want to have too many Pokemon of overlapping types. And while both Flygon and Garchomp share the same typing, they don't share the same space because one is better off the cuff with higher speed and attack, while the other needs a turn to become stronger than the other. On the other hand, option B is just to make the Pokemon better. Chien-Pao is a prime example of this. While it doesn't get fake out or knockoff like Weavile does, it does get a better ability, a better move pool, higher speed, an effectively higher attack because of its ability, and it's bulky enough to stomach some neutral hits. The combination of all of these traits have made Chien-Pao a much more effective wall breaker than Weavile. And Weavile became niche because it will basically never share the same space as it because it outclasses Weavile 9 times out of 10. Now is option B bad because it puts Weavile out of a spot? It's more complicated than that, but yes. Because Chien-Pao is stronger than Weavile, that means that Weavile is going to lose its representation in tournaments. Why would you risk using Weavile when Chien-Pao can just do so much more? Power creep doesn't save the meta, it just changes who the top dogs are. And if there was a Pokemon that was just better than Chien-Pao, that Pokemon would just become the new meta and the power creep would have risen again. The curve would keep rising until no one wants to play anymore. Pokemon is a game company with game developers, and power creep is something that is very well known in multiplayer games that span a long time. Well, they really haven't all that much actually, not until Generation 8. Where you could kind of just have whatever moves your Pokemon had since Generation 3. This led to Pokemon such as Wish Licky Licky or Belly Drum Hypno, from events from way back then. The problem now was that there was just a critical mass of Pokemon with moves that just had to be known and were allowed by the developers at the time of Ultra Sun and Moon. So much so that in the next game Sword and Shield, well, you know the rest. The culling of the National Dex was a controversial move for sure, one that we're still ruling the effects of to this day, but it did help with curbing power creep. Because some Pokemon were not allowed, some Pokemon actually got to thrive in a metagame where, if all Pokemon were allowed, it wouldn't have been a thing. Pokemon limiting the dex, whether it was for the reason they had stated or not, had artificially forced power creep to be reduced, by making sure that some Pokemon aren't in the game, impacting Smogon and VGC to some extent. When metagame staples like Incineroar or Porygon 2 are nowhere to be found, you have to look elsewhere for substitutes, and the addition of Pokemon having to have a special stamp to be legal in competitive play forever split how Pokemon are built. Some Pokemon lost their key moves and could no longer utilize moves they once had, more so in Gen 9 than Gen 8, but the idea still stands. They had artificially lowered the ceiling by cutting the decks. The thing about these cuts is that they're temporary. Eventually we get more Pokemon back into the metagame and power creep, leaving us back to where we started, where only the strongest Pokemon are seen, so to me it only feels like putting a bandage on a gaping wound. Before I tackle more solutions, I'd actually love to hear your ideas for how you would tackle this whole debacle. Would you introduce a ban list so that certain Pokemon aren't allowed for a format, or would you rather buff Pokemon so they can actually compete with the heavy hitters like I have? Let me know in the comments below. Another method is what I've been doing on this YouTube channel, buffing underwhelming Pokemon to keep them in line with the power curve. As Pokemon has progressed, the level of power has increased. Nowadays, you need more than just good stats to be viable, you may also need good abilities or a good move pool too. Some Pokemon have been left to the wayside because of this. Buffing them means that these Pokemon who are below the curve can now enjoy more viability, as they may not been able to consistently put up the same results as the best of the best, but they can still be in the same discussion as them. The one risk of doing this, however, is the homogenization of stats, and the difficulty of using them in-game. While I still very much like how I buffed Noctowl in my video, it has no place in being an early game bird Pokemon. It would be so far ahead of most other Pokemon, assuming it evolved at the same level, and if we buff every other Pokemon, then every Pokemon may feel samey. They all have the same moves and coverage options, and then it truly becomes a game of numbers, and move pools can't speak for the Pokemon anymore. But that's for old Pokemon. What about new additions, you may ask? Well, Pokemon in the competitive scene are judged based on their stats, right? Well then they just have to be more careful with how said stats are balanced. We got a lot of fast Pokemon this generation, and to make sure that the power curve doesn't increase again, they would just have to make sure that Pokemon stay within this range and don't hit too much harder than the Pokemon inside of it. Alternatively, and this one's the harshest, they could cap the power level by making sure that the strongest Pokemon don't appear in the next game. Making sure that certain staples are missing means that when it comes to selection, people have to make improvised choices. What if the fastest ice type was Cryogonal? What if the strongest physical dragon was Druddigon? What if the pinnacle of specially attacking fairies was Alchemy? What I'm saying is that Pokemon is aware of some Pokemon being stronger than others, so why not curb the decks even further? This adds the benefit of weaker Pokemon having a chance of representation, plus new Pokemon being added allows them to get the spotlight instead of being sidelined by old reliable. Let Crawdaunt and Sharpedo have a chance instead of Milotic and Slowbro, you know? Power creep is an issue that can't be solved in a traditional way. The only way is to know how to approach it and to make sure that it doesn't upset your player base too much. Pokemon, while not being as direct and frequent as other games, has to keep this in mind, as to not over-centralize and bore its players. And while I don't particularly like the restricted format as much, the amount of new specific techs that are done because of Pokemon missing from the previous lineup will be accounted for, and substitutes will be made if possible. Making sure that older Pokemon follow the current curve would allow more Pokemon to be in the spotlight, without overbearing the player base with a new threat to the metagame. Thank you so much for watching this video. I do really love diving into the game design element of games, and while I do have some more videos on the way, some Pokemon and some non-Pokemon, I do hope you can bear with me a little longer until I do release the Pokemon Reborn review, as it's going to be a long video, and it's something that I want to look back on without cringing. In the meantime, I'm going to be releasing more experimental videos, reviewing other monster taming games, talking about art in video games, and things like that. If you want to keep up to date with me on a more casual level, feel free to follow me on Twitter. It's not Pokemon focused, but it is me focused. So if you want to see more of my art, you know where to find it. And with all that being said, this is Oaken64, signing out.